May 28, 1942. The town of Gazala, Libya. Corporal Werner Hartmann of the British 7th Armoured Division pressed himself against the shattered wall of a desert outpost as German 88mm shells hammered the position. Dust and smoke filled the air. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with burning petrol. 3 of his mates lay dead in the sand. 2 more were wounded badly enough that they couldn't walk. The sound of tank treads grew louder. Hartmann's hands shook as he reloaded his Lee Enfield rifle. Not from fear of dying, though that fear was certainly present. Not from the concussion of the shells exploding around him. His hands shook because he knew what would happen when the Germans arrived. They would capture him. They would ask his name. And when he spoke, they would hear something that could get him killed immediately. Werner Hartmann wasn't his real name. It was Walter Hirschfeld. He had been born in Berlin 24 years earlier. His father had owned a small bookshop near Alexanderplatz. His mother had taught piano. They had lived in a modest apartment where the smell of coffee and old paper filled every room. On Friday evenings, his grandmother had lit Shabbat candles. They were Jews. German Jews who had considered themselves as German as anyone else until the Nuremberg laws told them otherwise. Walter had fled Germany in 1938 at age 19, one step ahead of Kristallnacht. His parents had sold everything they owned to buy him passage to England. They stayed behind, promising they'd follow soon. He never saw them again. In England, he'd enlisted in the British Army the moment war was declared. He spoke perfect English, having studied it in school, but his accent gave him away immediately. So did the hundreds of other German Jewish refugees who joined up. The army gave them British names, created new identity papers, and told them never to speak of their origins. If captured, they were to give only name, rank, and serial number. Never admit to being German. Never speak German unless absolutely necessary. The tank tread stopped. Silence, except for the moaning of the wounded. Then voices. German voices shouting orders. Raus. Kommen Sie raus. Come out. Hartmann looked at his rifle. 7 rounds left. Against a panzer company, 7 rounds meant nothing. He threw the rifle aside and raised his hands. 3 German soldiers appeared in the doorway, coal-scuttle helmets silhouetted against the bright desert sun. One of them gestured with his MP-40 submachine gun. Raus. Werner Hartmann walked out into the killing heat of the Libyan desert as a prisoner of war. His war wasn't over. It was about to become infinitely more complicated. The Germans lined up 27 British prisoners in the sand. Most were wounded. All were exhausted. A German Hauptmann, a captain, walked down the line, examining faces. He stopped in front of Hartmann. The Hauptmann was young, maybe 30, with sharp intelligent eyes. He said something in German to his sergeant. Hartmann kept his face blank, gave no indication he understood. You speak English? The Hauptmann asked in heavily accented English. Yes, sir. Name and rank? Corporal Werner Hartmann, sir. 7th Armored Division. The Hauptmann studied him for a long moment. You don't look British. Neither do half the lads in my unit, sir. The Empire's a big place. The Hauptmann smiled slightly but said nothing more. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven west, deeper into German-held territory. In the truck bed, pressed against his fellow prisoners, Hartmann closed his eyes and tried to control his breathing. That Hauptmann had suspected something. In a POW camp, there would be interrogations. There would be German officers who would ask questions, listen to answers, study faces and mannerisms. The truck convoy arrived at a temporary holding facility near Derna 3 hours later. It wasn't a proper POW camp yet, just a barbed wire enclosure with some tents and a water point. Guards herded the prisoners inside. They were given water, a bit of hard bread, and told they'd be processed the next day. Hartmann found a spot against the wire and sat down. A British Lance Corporal named Davies dropped down beside him. You all right, mate? Davies asked. Took a knock to the head back there. Hartmann nodded. His head did hurt, though not from any injury. It hurt from the constant tension of listening to German conversations all around him and forcing himself not to react. The guards were discussing whether they'd be moving the prisoners to Italy or keeping them in North Africa. One of them was complaining about the heat. Another was talking about a letter from his wife. Ordinary conversation. The kind Walter Hirschfeld would have understood without thinking when he lived in Berlin. Now it was information that could keep him alive. Or get him killed. That night, lying on the sand under a sky full of stars, Hartmann considered his options. He could continue pretending he understood nothing. That was safest. The moment anyone discovered he was a German Jew who'd joined the British Army, he would be handed over to the Gestapo. That meant torture and execution, either immediately or after they'd extracted whatever information they thought he possessed. But pretending ignorance meant surrendering the one advantage he had. He understood everything his captors said. He knew German military culture, German psychology, German ways of thinking. That knowledge could be valuable. Not just for his own survival, but for helping other prisoners. Maybe for intelligence gathering if he ever escaped or was liberated. The ethical calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Stay silent and survive as long as possible. Or use his knowledge and risk everything. There was a third option he hadn't fully confronted yet. He could admit to being German-born, claim he was a refugee who'd fled the Nazis, and hope for mercy. Some German officers might respect that. Others would see it as the ultimate betrayal. And if the wrong officer learned his real identity, word would reach the SS eventually. The next morning, German military police began processing prisoners. One by one, men were called to a tent where officers checked identity papers, asked questions, and filled out forms. When Hartmann's turn came, he found himself facing the same Hauptmann from yesterday. The man sat behind a folding table, smoking a cigarette. Sit. The Hauptmann gestured to a camp stool. Hartmann sat. Name. Corporal Werner Hartmann. Service number. Hartmann recited it. Unit. 7th Armored Division, sir. The Hauptmann made notes on a form. Then he looked up. Where were you born? The question hung in the air. This was the moment. Every prisoner of war faced this question. Most could answer truthfully. Hartmann could not. The Hauptmann's eyes never left his face, watching for the slightest tell. Liverpool, Hartmann said. My family moved to Liverpool, the Hauptmann interrupted. Interesting accent for Liverpool. Almost sounds educated. Private school perhaps. My mother was a teacher. She insisted on proper speech. The Hauptmann nodded slowly. He picked up another form from the table. We captured another British soldier yesterday who also had an interesting accent. He claimed to be from London but spoke like he'd learned English from a textbook. After some conversation, it became clear he was actually German. A refugee who joined the British forces. Hartmann said nothing. The Hauptmann continued, his tone conversational. We handed him over to the Gestapo. They were very interested to meet a German who'd taken up arms against his own country. I imagine things went poorly for him. He paused. Do you know what interests me about you, Corporal Hartmann? No, sir. You haven't asked about your wounded comrades. British soldiers always ask about their wounded. They're quite sentimental about such things. But you haven't said a word. Hartmann felt his heart pounding. I assumed they were being treated according to the Geneva Convention, sir. How civilized of you to mention the Geneva Convention. Most British soldiers just ask if their mates are alive. The Hauptmann crushed out his cigarette. Here's what I think. I think you're either extremely controlled or you're afraid of giving something away with too many words. I think perhaps you understand more German than you're admitting. I don't understand, sir. Don't you? Let me test something. The Hauptmann switched to German without warning. Tell me, how long have you been in England? Hartmann kept his face neutral, giving no indication he'd understood the question. The Hauptmann watched him for 10 seconds. Then he switched back to English. Well, if you don't speak German, that's fortunate for you. Return to the enclosure. Hartmann stood. As he reached the tent flap, the Hauptmann spoke again in German. One more thing. Hartmann almost turned. Almost responded to what the Hauptmann had said. He caught himself just in time, kept walking, forcing his body to move as if he'd heard nothing. But he knew. The Hauptmann knew. They both knew. 2 days later, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for transport to a permanent camp. Before departure, the Hauptmann walked through the enclosure, checking the manifest. When he reached Hartmann, he stopped. "Corporal Hartmann." "Sir. I'm assigning you to the transport manifest for Stalag VIIB. It's a large camp near Breslau. The senior British officer there is a colonel named Ravenscroft. He's asked for prisoners who might be useful in dealing with camp administration." Something in the way the Hauptmann said it made Hartmann look at him closely. The German officer's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something else. A calculation. A decision. "I don't understand, sir. Why would I be useful?" "Because Ravenscroft needs men who understand how Germans think. Men who might be able to navigate the camp bureaucracy effectively. I told him you seemed particularly perceptive during your interrogation." The Hauptmann handed him a slip of paper. "This authorizes you to work with the British camp leadership. Use it wisely." Before Hartmann could respond, the Hauptmann walked away. Hartmann looked at the paper. It was written in German, a simple authorization for Corporal Hartmann to serve as liaison between British prisoners and German camp administration. It said nothing about his real identity. But it said everything. The Hauptmann had given him official cover to speak German. More than that, he'd given him permission to use the one skill that could keep him alive and help his fellow prisoners. The question was why. The transport to Stalag VIIB took 4 days by rail. Hartmann spent most of it trying to understand what had happened. The Hauptmann had clearly suspected he was German. Instead of turning him over to the Gestapo, he'd given him a position that required speaking German. It made no sense unless the Hauptmann had decided Hartmann wasn't a threat. Or had decided he was more valuable as a liaison than as a corpse. Or perhaps the Hauptmann had simply been decent. Even in war, even in an army serving a monstrous regime, individual Germans made individual choices. Some chose cruelty. Some chose to look away. And a rare few chose small acts of mercy when they could. Stalag VIIB was a massive complex of wooden barracks surrounded by double wire fences and guard towers. It held nearly 15,000 prisoners, most of them British and French. The camp was organized by nationality, with separate compounds and a complex administrative structure. When Hartmann arrived, he was brought before Colonel Ravenscroft in the British section. Ravenscroft was in his 50s, a career officer with the bearing of a man who'd never stopped being in command despite being in a prison camp. He read the authorization from the Hauptmann, then looked at Hartmann. "So you speak German?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "How well?" "Fluently, sir." "Where did you learn it?" This was the moment. Hartmann could lie again, claim he'd studied it in school, keep the fiction going. Or he could trust this British officer with the truth. He chose truth. "I was born in Berlin, sir. I came to England in 1938. My family was Jewish. I joined the army in 1939 under a British name." Ravenscroft's expression didn't change. He nodded slowly. "I see. And the Germans don't know?" "One officer suspects, sir. The Hauptmann who gave me this authorization. But he didn't report it." "Do you know why?" "No, sir. I've been trying to understand it." Ravenscroft stood and walked to the window. Outside, prisoners moved between barracks under the watchful eyes of guards. "I'll tell you what I think. I think that Hauptmann gave you a choice. He could have destroyed you with a word. Instead, he gave you a tool. Now you have to decide what to do with it." For the next 3 years, Hartmann lived in a strange twilight between identities. To the British prisoners, he was Corporal Hartmann, the liaison who could speak to the Germans and sometimes get things done. Extra medical supplies. Better food for sick prisoners. Occasionally, news from the outside that the guards let slip in conversation. To the German camp staff, he was an educated British prisoner who spoke excellent German and could help maintain order. They never asked where he'd learned the language. He never volunteered the information. The fiction held because both sides found it useful. But the psychological weight was crushing. Every day, Hartmann heard his native language spoken by men who would kill him if they knew who he was. He heard guards discussing the war, complaining about rationing, talking about their families. Sometimes they said things that revealed what was happening to Jews in the East. Deportations. Labor camps. Worse things they didn't name directly but everyone understood. Hartmann listened and said nothing. He translated what seemed useful for Colonel Ravenscroft. He kept his own anguish private. At night, lying in his bunk, he thought about his parents. He'd received no word from them since the war began. He assumed they were dead, though he didn't know how or when. The weight of that uncertainty was sometimes more unbearable than certainty would have been. One evening in late 1943, a new prisoner arrived in the British compound. His name was Lieutenant Michael Bradford, a pilot who'd been shot down over Berlin. Bradford was brought to Ravenscroft's quarters for debriefing. Hartmann was called in to translate if needed. Bradford looked at him with barely concealed suspicion. After Ravenscroft dismissed the pilot, he turned to Hartmann. "That man thinks you're a collaborator." "I know, sir. It's going to get worse. The longer this war goes on, the more suspicious some prisoners will become of anyone who gets along with the Germans." Hartmann nodded. He'd seen it already. Some prisoners refused to acknowledge him. Others made comments just loud enough to hear about prisoners who forgot which side they were on. The irony was bitter. He was risking his life every day to help his fellow prisoners, using skills he'd been born with but could never acknowledge. And some of them thought he was a traitor. "I want you to know something," Ravenscroft said. "When this war ends, whenever that is, I'm going to make sure people understand what you did here. The risks you took. The help you provided. You have my word on that." "Thank you, sir. But I'd prefer if my real identity remained quiet." "Why?" Hartmann hesitated. How could he explain it? "Because I'm not sure who I am anymore, sir. I was Walter Hirschfeld. Then I was Werner Hartmann. Now I'm something else. A German Jew who speaks for British soldiers to German guards. When the war ends, I'll have to decide which of those people I want to be." Ravenscroft considered this. That's the burden of men who live between worlds. They're useful to everyone and trusted by no one. But they see things others miss. Remember what you've learned here, Corporal. Someday it might matter. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Poland, the Germans began evacuating prisoners westward. Stalag VIIB was emptied in a matter of days. 15,000 prisoners were formed into columns and marched through winter snow toward camps deeper in Germany. It would become known as the Death March. Hartmann marched with the British column. Men died every day from exhaustion, cold, and disease. Guards shot those who couldn't keep up. The strong helped the weak as much as they could, but there was a limit to what any man could do when he was starving and freezing himself. Hartmann used his German to negotiate with guards for shelter, for extra food, for permission to rest. Some guards listened. Others didn't. One night, they stopped in a town whose name Hartmann never learned. The prisoners were locked in a barn. Hartmann overheard two guards talking outside. They were discussing orders that had come down from higher command. If the SS arrived to take custody of certain prisoners, the Wehrmacht guards were to comply. No exceptions. The SS wanted all prisoners suspected of being Jewish or Russian or political. Hartmann felt ice in his stomach. Ravenscroft, lying nearby, saw his expression. "What is it?" Hartmann told him what he'd heard. Ravenscroft's face went hard. "How long do we have?" "They're not here yet. Maybe a day or two. Then we need to make sure you're somewhere else before they arrive." Over the next 24 hours, Ravenscroft and several other senior British officers worked quietly to arrange Hartmann's escape. They couldn't break him out, there was no safe place to go. But they could move him to a different column, one that was heading in a different direction, away from SS collection points. It took bribing guards with cigarettes and chocolate from Red Cross parcels. It took forged documentation. It took a dozen small acts of courage from men who barely knew Hartmann but trusted their officer's judgment. On the morning of the second day, as columns were reforming to continue the march, Hartmann was quietly transferred to a different group of prisoners heading northwest. He never saw Colonel Ravenscroft again. Years later, he learned the colonel had survived the war and returned to England. The SS unit arrived at the original column that afternoon, too late to find the prisoner they might have been looking for. Liberation came in April 1945. The column Hartmann was with was overrun by American forces near the Elbe River. He remembers the moment with perfect clarity. American Sherman tanks appeared on the road ahead. Guards threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Prisoners stood in the road, too tired and hungry to celebrate yet. An American lieutenant walked down the line of prisoners asking if anyone needed immediate medical attention. When he reached Hartmann, he said in English, "You're free now. The war's over." Hartmann nodded, unable to speak. The war was over. He was alive. The lieutenant moved on to check the next man. Hartmann sat down in the muddy road and cried. Not from relief, though he felt that too. He cried because he'd survived and his parents had not. Because he'd spent 3 years hiding who he was from the very people he'd been trying to help. Because he'd heard his native language spoken every day by men who would have killed him if they'd known the truth. The Americans took the former prisoners to a displaced persons camp. Hartmann gave his name as Werner Hartmann. He showed his British military documents. Nobody questioned it. In the chaos of liberation, with millions of refugees streaming across Europe, nobody had time to investigate every prisoner's backstory. But for Hartmann, the question of identity was far from settled. He spent weeks in the DP camp trying to decide what to do. He could return to England and continue being Werner Hartmann. The British military would discharge him with honor. He could build a life there. Or he could try to reclaim his original identity, become Walter Hirschfeld again. Search for any surviving family members. Figure out if he was still German or if that identity had died in the camps along with his parents. One day, a British Army chaplain came to the camp. He was interviewing German Jewish refugees who'd served in British forces, documenting their experiences. Hartmann, still using his British name, went to see him. The chaplain asked if he was Jewish. Hartmann admitted he was. How did you manage in the camps? The Germans didn't know. One officer knew. Or suspected. He chose not to report it. The chaplain shook his head in amazement. Do you know his name? Hauptmann Steiner. I saw his name on documents later. I don't know what happened to him after we were transferred. Would you want to find him? After what the Germans did? Hartmann thought about this for a long time. I don't know. Part of me wants to thank him. Part of me hates him for being part of the system that murdered my parents. I can't separate those feelings. That's honest, the chaplain said. More honest than most men would be. Hartmann decided to return to England as Werner Hartmann. Returning to Germany as Walter Hirschfeld felt impossible. The country he'd been born in had ceased to exist. The neighborhood where he'd grown up was destroyed. His family was gone. What would he return to? In England, he could start fresh. He'd have his military service record. He could claim he'd lost touch with family during the war, which was true enough. He could build a new life without constantly confronting the ghosts of the old one. It was a kind of cowardice, he knew. Or maybe it was survival. He was never quite sure which. Werner Hartmann returned to England in July 1945. He was demobilized in August with an honorable discharge and a small pension. He found work as a translator, ironically enough. Companies needed people who could speak both English and German as they tried to rebuild trade relationships with occupied Germany. Hartmann's fluency in both languages was valuable. He rarely spoke about his war experiences. When people asked, he gave the basic facts. Captured in North Africa, spent 3 years in a POW camp, liberated by Americans. He never mentioned being German-born. He never mentioned being Jewish. He never mentioned the Hauptmann who'd given him a gift he'd never fully understood. In 1947, he met a woman named Rebecca at a London synagogue. She was also a refugee, from Austria, also Jewish. They recognized something in each other, that quality of living between identities, of carrying secrets. They married 6 months later. He told her the truth about who he was. She was the only person who ever knew the whole story. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Hartmann insisted they be raised as British, with no connection to Germany. Rebecca argued for maintaining some cultural memory, teaching them about where their grandparents had come from. They compromised. The children learned they were Jewish. They learned their grandparents had died in the Holocaust. But they were told almost nothing about their father's time in the POW camp or how he'd survived by hiding in plain sight. Hartmann worked as a translator for 30 years. He was good at his job, able to move between languages effortlessly, understanding not just words but cultural context. His clients valued his ability to explain what Germans really meant when they said certain things, the unspoken assumptions beneath the formal language. He never returned to Germany. Not once. Rebecca went back in 1960 to see what remained of her childhood home in Vienna. She asked if he wanted to come. He refused. "I'm not ready," he said. He would never be ready. In 1968, his daughter asked him to talk to her school class about the war. She was 16, studying modern history. Her teacher had invited parents who'd served to share their experiences. Hartmann refused at first. Then he reconsidered. He went to the school and sat in front of 30 teenagers who knew almost nothing about the war beyond what they'd read in textbooks. He told them a carefully edited version of his story. British soldier, captured in North Africa, spent time in a POW camp, survived the death march, was liberated. One student asked if he'd been afraid of being tortured for information. Hartmann smiled slightly. "I was afraid every day. But not of torture. I was afraid of being discovered for who I really was." "What do you mean?" the student asked. "I mean that sometimes in war, your greatest danger isn't from the enemy's weapons. It's from the identity you were born with and cannot change." The classroom fell silent. The students didn't understand what he meant, not fully. His daughter understood. She'd known parts of the story, though not all of it. After the talk, she hugged him in the parking lot and whispered, "Thank you." In 1983, Werner Hartmann received a letter from Germany. It came from a lawyer in Munich representing the estate of a man named Hans Steiner, former Hauptmann in the Wehrmacht, deceased 3 months earlier. Steiner had left behind some personal effects, including a list of people he wished to be contacted after his death. One of those names was Corporal Werner Hartmann, formerly of the British 7th Armoured Division, last known address Stalag VIIIB. The lawyer explained that Steiner had spent years after the war trying to locate Hartmann, without success. He'd kept a file of papers related to his time as a prison camp officer, including documentation about certain prisoners he'd assisted. Before his death, Steiner had wanted Hartmann to know why he'd helped him. Enclosed with the letter was a handwritten note from Steiner, dated February 1983. The note was in German. Hartmann read it alone in his study, tears streaming down his face. Steiner wrote that he'd known from the first interrogation that Hartmann was a German Jew. The accent, the mannerisms, the way he responded to questions, everything had given him away to someone who knew what to look for. Steiner had faced a choice that day in the desert. Follow regulations and turn Hartmann over to the Gestapo. Or find another way. "I had already seen what the Gestapo did to people like you," Steiner wrote. "I had seen the reports from the East. I knew what was happening to Jewish prisoners. I could not be responsible for sending another man to that fate, even if he had taken up arms against Germany. Perhaps especially because he had taken up arms. It showed more courage than I possessed." Steiner explained that by giving Hartmann the liaison authorization, he'd hoped to create a situation where Hartmann's German language skills would be valued enough to protect him. If Hartmann was useful to both sides, neither side would look too closely at his background. It was a gamble, but it was the only option Steiner could think of that didn't involve either betraying a prisoner or betraying his own conscience. "I want you to know I never regretted that decision," the letter continued. "I spent the rest of my life trying to understand how an entire nation could embrace such evil. I never found a satisfactory answer. But I learned that individual choices matter, even small ones. Especially small ones. I hope you survived the war. I hope you found some peace. If you did, then perhaps my one small choice mattered." Hartmann sat in his study for a long time, holding the letter. He thought about writing back, even though Steiner was dead. He wanted to say that yes, the choice had mattered. It had saved his life. It had allowed him to help hundreds of other prisoners. It had given him a future that otherwise wouldn't have existed. But he also wanted to ask the questions that had haunted him for 38 years. How do you forgive someone who served a regime that murdered your parents? How do you hold gratitude and anger at the same time? How do you judge a decent act performed by someone wearing the uniform of evil? He never wrote the letter. Some questions don't have answers. Or they have too many answers, all of them true and contradictory. Instead, he kept Steiner's note in a drawer in his desk. Sometimes he would take it out and read it again, trying to make sense of the strange bond that had existed between captor and prisoner, German and Jew, two men who'd briefly acted with humanity in an inhumane time. Werner Hartmann died in 1999 at age 81. His obituary listed him as a translator and veteran of World War II. It mentioned his service in the British Army, his capture in North Africa, his time as a prisoner of war. It said nothing about his original name or his original identity. His family respected his wish to be remembered as the man he'd chosen to become rather than the man he'd been born as. But after his death, his daughter found a box of papers in his study. Documents from the war, letters from Colonel Ravenscroft, the authorization from Hauptmann Steiner, and dozens of pages of notes Hartmann had written late in life. A fragmentary memoir of his time in the camps, written in German, the language he'd hidden for so many years. She published some of those notes in a small historical journal that specialized in personal accounts of the war. They attracted attention from historians studying the experiences of German Jewish refugees in British service. There weren't many such stories, and even fewer where the refugee had been captured and forced to hide his identity among his former countrymen. One researcher tracked down records from Stalag VIIIB and found references to Corporal Hartmann in the camp's administrative files. The notes confirmed he'd served as liaison between British prisoners and German camp staff. They confirmed he'd been valued by both sides for his language skills and his ability to navigate between cultures. They said nothing about his real identity. The researcher also found records of Hauptmann Hans Steiner. He'd survived the war, been briefly detained by American forces, and was released after minimal denazification proceedings. Officers who'd served in prison camp administration were generally treated less harshly than combat officers, especially if there were no documented war crimes. Steiner had returned to Munich, worked as a civil servant for 30 years, and died peacefully. There was no indication he'd ever been punished or even questioned about his decision to protect a German Jewish prisoner. Perhaps nobody ever knew. Or perhaps in the chaos of post-war Germany, with millions of crimes to investigate, one Hauptmann's small act of mercy simply didn't register. The story of the prisoner who spoke perfect enemy language isn't a story about heroism, at least not in the conventional sense. Werner Hartmann never stormed a machine gun nest. He never led a daring escape. He never committed acts of sabotage or dramatic resistance. His courage was quieter and more complicated. It was the courage to hide who he was every single day for 3 years. The courage to listen to his native language spoken by men who would have killed him if they'd known the truth. The courage to help his fellow prisoners while knowing that some of them suspected him of collaboration. It's also a story about the Hauptmann who chose mercy when cruelty would have been easier. Hans Steiner had every reason to follow regulations. In the Wehrmacht of 1942, officers who showed leniency to Jewish prisoners risked their own careers or worse. Steiner had chosen to take that risk for a man he'd interrogated once, a man he barely knew, because he could not reconcile his conscience with what he knew would happen if he followed orders. There's a temptation to make this story simple. To say that Hartmann was good and Steiner was good and therefore everything worked out. But it's not that simple. Steiner wore the uniform of an army that was conquering Europe for a regime that was murdering millions. His one act of mercy didn't erase his participation in that system. Hartmann's survival came at the cost of hiding his identity so thoroughly that even other prisoners doubted his loyalty. Neither man emerged from the war unchanged or unburdened. What remains is the complexity. The reality that wars are fought by individuals making individual choices within systems of massive violence. That sometimes those choices are impossible to judge cleanly as right or wrong. That gratitude and anger can coexist in the same heart. That survivors carry burdens no one else can fully understand. Werner Hartmann lived 54 years after the war ended. He built a life, raised a family, worked an ordinary job. He was, by all accounts, a kind man, a devoted father, a loyal friend. People who knew him described him as thoughtful, careful with words, someone who listened more than he spoke. They had no idea what he'd survived. How could they? The hidden identity he'd carried through those 3 years in captivity never quite left him. He remained Werner Hartmann for the rest of his life, legally and socially. But in private moments, Rebecca said, he would sometimes slip into German, speaking to himself in the language he'd been forced to conceal. The mother tongue that had nearly gotten him killed but had ultimately saved his life. On the mantel in his study, he kept a photograph from before the war. A young man in Berlin, standing outside a bookshop, smiling at the camera. That was Walter Hirschfeld. The man who'd existed before the world burned. The man he'd had to kill in order to survive. The photograph stayed there until the day Hartmann died, a reminder of someone he'd been and could never be again. Perhaps the Hauptmann's letter mattered most because it confirmed what Hartmann had suspected but never known for certain. Someone had seen him. Not just the British corporal he pretended to be, but the German Jewish refugee underneath. Someone had seen him and chosen to protect him anyway, not because of who he pretended to be but because of who he actually was. In a war that demanded people erase their identities or die, that recognition carried a weight beyond measure. The prisoner who spoke perfect enemy language survived because language is more than words. It's culture, memory, understanding. It's the ability to exist between worlds, to see from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Werner Hartmann possessed that ability, though it came at a price. He spent the rest of his life living between identities, never fully belonging to any single one. That's the inheritance of people who are forced to hide who they are in order to live. They survive, but something essential is lost in the translation. Maybe that's why Hartmann never wrote back to Steiner, even in death. Because some conversations can't be completed. Some debts can't be repaid. Some connections exist beyond judgment or resolution, in that complicated space where gratitude and grief and guilt all meet and refuse to be separated. The letter remained in Hartmann's desk drawer, unacknowledged but preserved, like the memory of the man he'd been before the war transformed him into someone else. Today, there are no memorials to Werner Hartmann or the hundreds of other German Jewish refugees who served in British forces during the war. Their stories remain largely unknown outside academic circles. They occupy an uncomfortable place in historical memory, neither fully British nor fully German, Jews who'd fled persecution only to be captured by the very regime that had driven them into exile. But their experience illuminates something important about identity and survival in wartime. They prove that the categories we create, ally and enemy, British and German, us and them, are always more complicated than they appear. That individuals can exist simultaneously in multiple worlds, speaking multiple languages, holding multiple loyalties without being disloyal to any. Werner Hartmann spoke perfect enemy language because it was also his mother tongue. That paradox defined his war and shaped his life. He was a man who lived between definitions, surviving by being something his captors couldn't quite categorize. In the end, perhaps that's the most anyone can do when caught in the machinery of history. Find the spaces between, the gaps in the system where individual humanity persists despite everything trying to crush it. The war ended 79 years ago. The prisoner and the Hauptmann are both gone. What remains is the story, imperfect and unresolved, of two men who briefly acted with more humanity than the times required. That's not a lesson or a moral. It's simply what happened. And sometimes, that's enough.